Well, today's deal was celebrated in the Alberta legislature, but the governing United Conservative MLAs also cheered at news of the resignation of Stephen Guilbeault, who quit Mark Carney's cabinet over this deal.
Today is full of incredibly good news. We got rid of the emissions cap, Mr. Speaker. We have a new pipeline coming here to Alberta, and we just learned that Stephen Guilbeault has resigned from the federal cabinet.
And done amazingly good things for Canada. My understanding he's going to continue to be a member of caucus, and I think that's great for his constituents, and I think that's good for the government.
The alarms didn't go off in Washington. No breaking news banner flashed across American TV. But make no mistake, what just happened in Canada may hit the United States harder than anyone is prepared for. Because in a single afternoon, Canada set itself on a new path, one that could reshape North America's energy map, shift global oil flows toward Asia, and push U.S. Canada trade into an era of unpredictable tension. And the most shocking part? It happened while Canadians cheered the resignation of their own federal environment minister, a sign of just how divided the country has become over the future of oil, pipelines, and climate commitments. Today's story begins in the Alberta legislature, where lawmakers erupted in applause as news broke that the federal environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault, had resigned from the cabinet. The moment wasn't really about him, it was about what his departure symbolized. Because only hours earlier, Prime Minister Mark Carney had signed a sweeping agreement with Alberta that could revive a major oil pipeline to the west coast, weaken national environmental rules, and open the door for Canadian crude to flow not just to the United States, but directly to Asia. For Americans, that last part is the real earthquake. For decades, the United States has relied on Canada as its most stable, predictable, and friendly supplier of oil. While the Middle East faltered, while Russia went to war, while Venezuela collapsed, Canada remained the quiet, reliable northern partner. But Alberta has been growing impatient. They don't want to be dependent on the U.S. market forever. They want access to the Pacific Ocean. They want Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, and especially China, to bid on their oil, driving prices up and giving Alberta more leverage. And with this new federal agreement, Alberta finally got what it has wanted for years, a clear path toward a West Coast export pipeline. But as this new relationship between Alberta and Ottawa emerges, something else is breaking down. British Columbia, the province the pipeline must pass through, is furious. Their premier wasn't consulted. Their First Nations communities weren't warned. Environmental groups say this move destroys Canada's ability to meet its climate goals. And now, a federal cabinet minister has quit in protest, a rare and dangerous sign of division at the highest level of government. The United States isn't watching this closely yet, but it needs to. Because if Canada shifts even a portion of its future oil exports away from American buyers and toward the Pacific, it will immediately change U.S. energy prices. The U.S. depends on Canadian crude more than any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Mexico, more than anyone. The pipeline being discussed would move close to 1 million barrels per day. That is not a small number. That is enough to rattle the American market, increase transportation costs, raise gasoline prices, and force the U.S. to increase its reliance on more unstable foreign suppliers. The real question isn't whether this affects the United States, it's how fast the shockwaves arrive. Because Alberta has already said the quiet part out loud, they want independence from U.S. market pressure. They want global buyers competing for their oil. They want to break the perception that America is the only guaranteed destination. And with this agreement, Ottawa has essentially given them permission to explore that dream. In the CBC interview that followed the deal, Alberta politicians openly celebrated. Meanwhile, Canada's Energy Minister Tim Hodgins tried to calm the storm, insisting this was good for the environment, pointing to carbon pricing, methane agreements, and a nuclear strategy. But nobody was talking about those details. Everyone was talking about the pipeline. Everyone was talking about the tanker ban that may now be weakened. Everyone was talking about the fact that Canada might be preparing to send its oil somewhere other than the United States. This isn't just an economic story. It's a political one, and a story of deepening national fractures. Alberta and Ottawa have fought for decades over climate policy, carbon caps, production limits, oil sands emissions, and federal regulations. But this deal marks a turning point. Alberta appears to have won. The federal government backed down on several climate rules in order to secure cooperation on carbon pricing and to avoid a larger constitutional crisis. And now, British Columbia is positioned as the new battleground. The BC Premier is furious. Their coastal First Nations communities are outraged. LNG developers say a weakened tanker ban could jeopardize billions of dollars in approved projects. And environmental groups believe this will undo years of national climate planning. But Alberta doesn't care. They smell victory. Ottawa is cornered. And now, one of Canada's most high-profile environmental ministers has resigned, a sign that this fight is far from over. The United States is about to feel the fallout, whether it wants to or not. Here's why: Canada's pipeline network has always pointed south. But if even one new major pipeline points west, toward tankers and the Pacific, Canada suddenly has new options, and new leverage. When Alberta can sell to Asia, it no longer has to accept lower US refinery prices. When Canadian oil goes global, it becomes part of a bidding war. Asian buyers pay more. That means US refiners will have to pay more. And that means everyday Americans, from truckers to farmers to commuters, eventually pay more too. But the ripple effects go further. When oil prices rise, everything rises. Transportation, groceries, heating, shipping, manufacturing. And with US-China tensions already reaching their highest point in years, the idea of Canadian crude flowing toward Chinese tankers will raise alarms in both Washington and the Pentagon. Energy independence has always been a national security issue. And while Canada remains a friendly nation, Washington will not ignore a shift that increases Asia's access to North American oil. And the US-Canada trade relationship. That's where this story becomes a warning. Canada already feels that the United States takes its energy for granted. Alberta believes America relies on them but gives nothing in return. At the same time, US lawmakers, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, aren't ready to compete with Japanese, Indian, or Chinese demand for Canadian crude. If this pipeline moves ahead, and if Alberta wins this fight, US politicians may respond with tariffs, new energy policies, or pressure on Canada within the USMCA agreement. In other words, a trade war is not impossible. The seeds are already planted. Meanwhile, Canada itself is entering a dangerous internal moment. Alberta and Ottawa are in an uneasy alliance, but climate advocates inside the government feel betrayed. British Columbia is preparing for a political showdown. Indigenous nations are ready to challenge the process in court. Environmental organizations are calling this the end of national standards. And the federal cabinet has already taken its first casualty. You cannot call this normal politics. This is a realignment, a shift in power, economics, geography, and global strategy. And it's happening on America's doorstep. The truth is simple: when Canada changes the direction of its pipelines, it changes the direction of its future. And that future may no longer be tied exclusively to the United States. Alberta wants the Pacific. Ottawa is willing to negotiate. British Columbia is resisting. And Washington is still asleep at the wheel. But that won't last long. Because the moment the price of gasoline jumps, or the moment American refineries feel squeezed, or the moment Chinese tankers begin loading Canadian crude off the West Coast, the United States will realize what just happened. Canada is no longer thinking only north-south. It is thinking east-west. It is thinking global. And once that door opens, it will never fully close again. What began as cheering inside the Alberta legislature might soon become the beginning of a new era, one where North America's energy balance is rewritten, where Canada's political unity is tested, and where the trade relationship between the United States and Canada enters one of its most uncertain periods in decades. And when that moment arrives, Americans will look north and realize the shock wasn't coming. It was already here.